And I know a lot of the criticism of the story has been based on that basic argument.
Yeah. This is the part of it that we spent, a long time looking at before we ever decided to make this information public, because there's a lot of research into this field. I would argue far more than a lot of other measures of teacher performance that we use every day. And there's people on all sides of this issue. So there are some significant limitations to this. The first one is really important. It's based on standardized tests, and we know standardized tests aren't perfect. Within that, you get all kinds of statistical issues and limitations of this. And the question is, are you isolating out the signal from the noise, and to what ability can you do that? And is this giving you some piece of information that would be that is accurate enough to act upon? Having surveyed a lot of the leading people in the field on this, including a lot of the leading skeptics on this issue, we came to the conclusion that most people who understand how this works and have studied it feel like it is a vast improvement over the current approach. So currently we do achievement testing, and we hold schools accountable to it, and to a certain extent teachers are held accountable for achievement. And value added is just a great benefit and far better than that, far more robust, because we're looking at individual students. At the school level, most people like it and think it's a very valuable tool for looking at growth that isolates out and can tell you sometimes, can take out some of the demographic issues that tend to skew the achievement test. At the teacher level, it becomes more tenuous, because you're dealing with, in essence, in kind of lay terms, the fewer data points you have to make an estimate, the less reliable that estimate is. And so with an individual teacher, in a single school year, you may have in an elementary classroom 20 to 25 kids. And you're trying to say, if these 25 kids all went on average down 5 points, can we attribute that to that teacher? And what you don't know is, on the day of the test, was there a dog barking outside the window that screwed all those kids up? And that's not the teacher's fault. It's the fault of the dog barking outside the window. So the question becomes one of kind of where do you draw lines and how do you make judgment calls while building the model to make it as reliable as possible and as useful as possible. We opted to try to be as conservative as possible while still provide this information. And so we, for example, chose to limit our study to 60 teachers who had 60 student scores that we could attribute. In elementary school, that usually meant 2 or 3 years of experience. On average, most of our teachers had far more than that. So a lot of our teachers had 7 years of student scores that we based it on. I think if we averaged all of our teachers, there were 100 students per teacher. So any one given student may have had a bad year, may have had a divorce, may have joined a gang that year. And the idea is that the more students you have, the more robust that estimate will be. So we try to be conservative on that front. Nevertheless, there was a lot of criticism of our approach and of this approach in general because of these issues. And I think a big part of the debate has become, how reliable is this or not?
Right. So certainly there are issues around how valid and reliable are these measures, and having more students, having more years of data, those can certainly make the measures more reliable. For those students who are interested, we've posted a couple of readings on the discussion notes section that go into a little bit more detail, but in a non-technical way, around some of these issues around reliability. And I particularly commend to you a report that came out just today from Brookings, which talks a little bit about issues of reliability and validity, but also talks about how all of the measures we use in whatever evaluation system we use are imperfect. So if we evaluate teachers or any other professionals through observation or through some supervisor evaluation, whatever method we use, there is going to be some errors that are made. And in large part, I think a lot of the debate over teacher value added comes back not so much to the technical validity and reliability of the measures, but what, in fact, they should be used for. And we'll come to that in just a minute. I'd like to, could you talk a little bit about the visits to classrooms you did and the discussions with teachers that you had after you'd done this analysis?
So as we were doing the analysis, we were going out and visiting classrooms of teachers. And, we do that for two reasons. One is you want to illustrate your story with real-life people and see what this looks like. But also an element of it was kind of testing the data. If we were finding that what the data was telling us conflicted dramatically with what principals and teachers and parents and others said, then we were going to come back and push back hard on the data. And we did that several times, where we found things that caused concern, and then we went back and looked and made adjustments. So part of it was just essentially testing. Now, what's interesting about that process is this happened a few times, where you'd go into a teacher's classroom and and the principal would say, "This is one of my most effective teachers," and the teacher would say, "Look, I've got great degree. I'm nationally board certified. I've been doing this for 20 years. I go to professional development every summer, and I'm a dedicated teacher. I'm about continuous improvement. I'm always reading books about how to be a more effective teacher." And you talk to the parents, and the parents say, "This teacher is the most dedicated teacher I've ever seen." Well, in our analysis, that teacher was really not contributing much to those kids' education. So the question that comes out of that is, what's going on? Is the data wrong? Is the principal wrong? Are all the people that know this teacher wrong? Or are we talking about different things? And I think the answer, and it's we included an example of this in our story because it's an important question to ask. Value-added measures a very narrow thing. It's the performance of students on standardized tests. And so, of course, what you find is there are teachers who are incredible teachers who don't do well at those two key elements. And there are teachers who are also very great at other things that are important to teaching. So we included that woman as kind of an example of that, of someone who the parents love, who may have had an emotional connection with their kids that was really important. But those kids were not making much progress on standardized tests. In fact, they were really being harmed in the areas of English and math achievement in a way that would probably affect later. But it's a tricky question. I mean, when the data conflicts with what you hear from others, who's right? And it's not an easy question to answer.
So were teachers, most teachers happy to learn of their value-added scores? Were they defensive? What were the different reactions that you got?
This really surprised me because we knew that there was, but the nature of our analysis was that there was exactly the same number of highly effective teachers as highly ineffective teachers, because it's essentially a relative. So there was just going to be equal numbers of both, and we'd have to talk to both. That meant we would have to talk to people who we were going to say, the numbers really don't pan out for you. What struck me, and so of course we anticipated people not being happy to hear that. What struck me was how desperate teachers were for meaningful feedback. So in a lot of cases, what we heard from teachers who were both highly effective and less effective and somewhere in the middle was, "Thank you so much for giving me some feedback. Why is it a newspaper reporter is showing me this number? Why hasn't the school district been giving me this kind of feedback? And why has my principal not visited me in 3 years?" So I think teachers really want feedback on their performance and don't get enough attention and don't get enough of that from the current setup, at least in LA schools. And this is one way in which they can get some feedback, and a lot of the teachers were really reflective about that. What can I do different to make these scores better?
Right. I mean, one of the interesting things about, I think, the series of stories is the revelation that the district has had these data for years, but they've never actually been used in any way, even internally, to help, at least to help raise discussions, raise questions about, am I doing more or less? Is the teacher down the corridor doing worse or better than I am, and if so, why? And in general, I hope as students, certainly as professors, we always think more data is better than none, and we can try to use it in smart ways or stupid ways. And if it's used as one measure, one indicator that we can then go out and test with our eyes by observing, by having independent observers look at classroom practice, whatever else may be necessary, it can only help to have an additional piece of information, even if we reject using it for any high-stakes purpose, ultimately.
I think it's an important point because what the focus of the conversation after our series has been on one aspect of value-added and use of value-added information, which is really the teacher evaluation component. What's key and what we've been trying to write about since then is there's a myriad of other things that you can use this information to help inform decision making. And it can have a huge impact, and it can really benefit kids in schools. And it can just make us smarter in terms of decisions we make in public education. So school value-added scores are really important and oftentimes tell you a very different picture from an achievement-based system like the API in California. You oftentimes get a really different picture of what's going on at the school. You can use value-added to help match teachers to their strengths. So a teacher may be really good at teaching low-level kids and not very good at challenging the high-level kids. Value-added, and some schools have really used this to effect, can use the data to pinpoint what your strengths are as a teacher and say, let's get you with teachers with students who you're really good at teaching. And there's results that come from that are really impressive. So there's a number of things that this can be used for. The focus has been, with good reason, on teacher evaluations.
And what was the reaction of the school district? What effect has those reports had on actual policy or action, or begun to have, maybe?
So starting with that first series that I mentioned, where we talked about how hard it was to dismiss teachers who are accused of crimes, the school district had begun to address teacher effectiveness issues and started a committee that was discussing it. And as committees at school districts do, they tend to kind of take months, make a report, and then nothing happens is generally the way it goes. So that was very much on track as we were working on this project. And within 3 days of when our story was first published, the school district announced that it was going to reopen negotiations with the teachers union on the teacher evaluation component and try to get value added in there. So there was an immediate and pretty striking reaction. The union's reaction was just as immediate and just as bold. They started picketing the newspaper. They organized a boycott of the newspaper and vowed to not cave in on these and allow test scores to be used to measure teachers. So in some ways it polarized people, but there was definitely a movement. I mean, I think it put this to the top of the agenda. And around this time, the school district also got a new deputy superintendent who was laser focused on issues of teacher effectiveness. He had read the research. He had been at the Gates Foundation that would actually funded some of this research, and he knew that getting more effective teachers in front of kids was the key. And so he helped, I think, push this agenda. And and then the conversation spread, and I think across the country you saw this issue rise to the top of the agenda in different districts and in different contexts, and always controversial and contentious, but at least people were talking about it.
Yeah, this is the reports were certainly timely because, as you know, the national policy discussion, race to the top from the Obama administration, has pushed many states already to think about how to use value-added measures within the context of a teacher evaluation system. Right. And for all of you who are all over the country, there are at least 50 districts across the country that already have in their teacher contracts some teacher value-added measures as part of the teacher evaluation system, and largely because of federal policy, but this is going to continue to spread. So I think those of you out there who are not yet in classrooms but will be soon are likely to encounter a conversation at least about teacher value added and what role it would play in evaluating your own performance. What should our students, what else should our students know about this debate, and what can they do to both inform themselves and be part of the discussion, do you think?